Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to more Archon's Armory. Today we'll be talking about automatons, robots, servitors, and similar creatures of the 41st millennium. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So, the lore and mythos of servitors. The first big one that we're going to talk about a lot is artificial intelligence. Now, AI, or artificial intelligence, is a thing in our modern day, but it works a little bit differently in 40k. Now, artificial intelligence was a technology that existed during the Dark Age of technology, and theoretically before that, but what it really is a centralized mind or a connected mind. The Adeptus Mechanicus often refer to it as a collection of collected animate computers. It is essentially, because they don't want to say AI or abominable intelligence instead of artificial intelligence, they use that idea of multiple computers working together in concert, replacing the human mind. There is a lot of controversy about why AI is or is not useful or extant or works in 40k. I have always subscribed to the theory that essentially AI is afflicted permanently by the existence of chaos. So, because chaos in the period of the Dark Age of technology was much more dormant, the birth of Slaanesh had not necessarily affected it so much that it had come into real space in all that much numbers. Essentially, after Old Night, after the expansion of warp energy into the galaxy, and after really the waking up of the Chaos Gods to be active in real space, artificial intelligence was pretty okay before that. It was capable of doing jobs, it worked whole ships, it organized things like Titans, it could set up colonies, it could do all types of things that we think about AI working on today. After Chaos, essentially after Old Night, there was this universal trauma, almost this horrible event that was Old Night, or the horrible event that was the expansion or the increase of Chaos's activity within real space, that permanently tainted all artificial intelligence, including newly made artificial intelligence, because there have been attempts to recreate AI in modern 40k, and the result has been the same. Artificial intelligence goes through all of these calculations, make all these decisions, but at the end of the day, the conclusion that they reach almost universally is exactly the same. And that conclusion is that chaos will eventually wipe out all resistance in the galaxy if it is not defeated in some way. And then the result is the only food for chaos, or the most efficient food for chaos, is human beings. Thus, a vast majority of AI with the intelligence to understand these concepts will turn genocidal and try and kill every single human that they can possibly kill. Because, essentially, to save themselves, or even if it's an idea to, keep humans alive or to prevent the race from destruction, if that's programmed into them, they will still see, essentially, genociding humans as the only option to continue operation. Now that's my personal experience with AI and my opinion of why you can't use it in 40k. Essentially, any AI that you make, whether it's a toaster or a tank, will essentially universally conclude at the end of all of its, computations and understandings, once it gets in connection with either the Noon Sphere or some other way of rapidly expanding its knowledge or its communication rays, which it will need to do, because to connect with a lot of different mechanical things and to attach to all these different physical systems, it will need to gain this knowledge. Once it gains knowledge of chaos, it's all over. The AI will almost universally reach the conclusion that chaos, this unknowable, impossible to defeat force, is fueled by humanity. Humanity is a direct threat to its existence. The AI will try and genocide all humans. And you can see this with a lot of things that are left over from the Dark Age. They view humans as basically like Am does in I Have No Mouth But I Must Scream. They want to kill them all. They have Very little compunction or respect from for human life, and that's why a vast majority of the time, if the Mechanicus come across AI, they go out of their way to try and absolutely destroy it, or separate it from as much other things as possible to try and study it, but that is very much in the, like, black, dark, evilest pit of heresy. They do not like artificial intelligence. It is terrible. In relation to that, and, oh wait, sorry, I'll go into that in a second. So that's the big thing with artificial intelligence. Essentially, you can't do it because all the AI will eventually learn about chaos, and they will come to the conclusion, almost universally, because of the trauma of Old Night, that humanity is responsible for chaos existing, expanding, and gaining power. Humans need to be destroyed in order for chaos to be beaten. The AI will turn against humanity. Again, there are other interpretations of that lore. That's just, to me, the most logical one, the one that follows with the Old Night lore and the, collective trauma of artificial intelligence, of, being part of that expansion of humanity, and then suddenly becoming paranoid, violent, and genocidal afterward. The next part is war robots and military robots. So, this is more of a thing of, are all servitors or robots just military? And I actually argue that there are way more civilian servitors than there are military ones. And obviously we won't just be talking about servitors in this, but a vast majority of the quote-unquote robots that you will run into in the Imperium are going to be servitors. They will be these lobotomized, half-human, cyborg, brain-using but slightly programmed creatures that stumble around or attach to machinery, and they do a simple task using the human mind as a computer instead of computing. So, warp robots and military robots make up the upper, 10 to 20% of these. That includes combat servitors, includes cataphrons and castellans, the ones that we'll be talking about from the Mechanicus, and they are pretty darn good in general, but just the myth is that they are not all military. Matter of fact, the vast majority of these robots, again, quote-unquote, are civilian in origin and civilian in use. Cyborgs versus robots. So, I don't like to use the term cyborg for servitors. While there are true robots in 40k, there are a lot of limitations to coding within the Imperium of Man, so a lot of things that we, in our reality, would traditionally take care of via writing software, using different types of hardware, computers, etc., the Imperium has strict limitations on this, because it is really hard to make new coding in the Imperium. Essentially, where we would make a very simple, circuit and a motherboard to open up a door, for example, something really basic, or turn on a fan. The Mechanicus, instead of doing that, if they don't necessarily have that coding, just ready on a chip already, the data wafer that they use, if they don't have that, instead of trying to make something new, they will literally tear off every part of a human being that isn't necessary except for the brain, and then they will slave the brain to doing that one task. So you might come across a lot of doors in the Imperium that aren't opened up by a little push button, unless it's mechanical. They're not opened up by some sort of code or anything. It will be a servitor or a robot that has a human brain controlling it, and some basic coding, things to recognize what to do, what not to do, and a lot of the time it's via psycho-indoctrination, it's not even via coding or data wafers, and they will do the job of the computer instead of a computer doing it. And that is one of the reasons that I don't like to call them cyborgs, because cyborg implies that there is something human within the servitor, and that they are treated like some sort of mechanized human. That's not the case. Servitors are treated and they're thought about like we think of basic electronic components. So if you look at your motherboard on your computer, or your battery and your screen of your phone, that's how Imperials look at servitors. They're tools. They use human flesh and human brains for computing, yes, but they're not human. For a lot of reasons that we'll get into when we talk about servitors, but they're not viewed as human. They're not seen as yes, a worker. That's not how it works. They're seen as a tool. They're seen as literally a walking, moving function of society. In a lot of cases, there will be hundreds, thousands, millions of servitors on a single world, most of them slave to do a very simple task or a series of simple tasks. So you might say, well, how can every door be its own individual servitor? It doesn't have to be. Sometimes it might be, okay, there's a camera in front of each door, and then there's a servitor somewhere in a security room on that floor or on that level whose one sole and only job is to look at a screen, identify the person trying to open the door and what numbers they put in, and then think about it for a second, decide whether those were good numbers, and then open the door mechanically, via a button that it presses. So it is way less complicated than a cyborg because there's nothing human about them. And they're not viewed as human. They're not viewed as independent or individual whatsoever. They're viewed as machines and tools. And then you get to actual robots. So these are the ones that divorce human flesh from mechanics. There's not a ton of these. Some of them are seen as heretical, and some of them are very ancient archaeotech. But in general, robots are not as common. You can call certain things robots, but they're not always the same exact thing. We'll talk about the difference between like Castellan robots and cataphrons. Cataphrons look very mechanical. They look like you've taken everything human away from them, and they are very different from servitors because you've stripped away a lot more, essentially, material and replaced it with parts. But the Castellan is a true robot because it was never human. It's not running on any brain matter. It's not using any physical muscles. And it hasn't stripped out anything of the human to use its programming. It's pure programming. Getting to that, we have robo-brains versus coding. Now, this isn't robo-brains like we think about with Fallout. This is robo-brains as in literally taking the human mind, taking a brain, a functioning brain. You have to keep it, alive and functioning with all of its various connections to the body, and hijacking it with technology. How do you do that? There's a lot of different ways, and we'll get into this when we get to servitors, but in general, you replace non-essential functions of the body with technology. And you might think, that's way harder than just writing a piece of code or writing a piece of technology or a mechanical item. The Mechanicus are so good at this. They are incredibly talented at taking the human form and stripping away everything that is not necessary and replacing it with a better option. And I'll go into that when I go into the art over here. But the coding side of things, the few things that can be done with coding, they're generally done with extant code. So you might have 1,000 data wafers that come out of a Mechanicus Forge world, and all of them, all that they do is that they tell electronics to close a door, or they tell a light to turn on. And they are these very basic, almost like cartridges of big, heavy code. It's not really... Essentially, it is a lot more complicated and a lot larger in terms of scale to make these complex series of codes than it would be to just take a human being and use their brain plus some psycho indoctrination and a little bit of data wafering, putting a computer that tells them what to do. Even something really basic like, okay, here's how you open the door with your hands that you don't know how to use because we took out half of your brain. But it's still the human doing it, technically. It's still the brain doing the motions, making the function. But in reality, they're not doing it of their own accord. They're not thinking about it. Their brains are just kind of going, activate the pathway that uses your hand to open the door. Or activate the neural pathway that knows how to walk and move its legs. So that robo-brain thing is a lot more common than coding, because coding is very complicated, and the means by which it is delivered is usually going to be limited to very discrete, very small processes. One of the reasons for this is actually related to AI, in a way. Because the Mechanicus are afraid of machines working together, they view abominable intelligence as machines working together without human interference. They want to slave code to a human brain as much as they can. Which means that they don't want a whole bunch of wafers doing a bunch of different things unless it's required, unless the human brain can't be modified to do it, because they're afraid of those machines working together. Essentially, if it's too complicated, if it's too many pieces, if it's too much technology forced into one contiguous line, this codes into this, activates this, doing this. They don't want a Rube Goldberg machine, like a complicated supercomputer, working together, because That smacks of AI. That scares them, that idea of the machine can start working independently. And because, machines don't work independently, that's not how logic works. There is actually something to this in their fear of AI because the Void Dragon, or rather, my personal opinion, the machine spirit is a real thing in 40k. Now, there's some modern lore that says that the machine spirit is a result of the Void Dragon. I don't necessarily agree with that, since it is pretty obvious that the machine spirit exists in areas where Necron Soul Tech would have absolutely no effect whatsoever. For example, in Chaos Forces. But the real idea here is that machinery, independent machinery, including things like vehicles, anything not slave to a human, is going to eventually, if it is large and complex enough, draw some sort of, not consciousness, but activity. It has something about it that is wrong. It's not following the laws of logic. It might turn on by itself. It might start activating or deactivating things. It might turn on or off certain portions of itself, or even start to check things on itself. But in that way, the Mechanicus are terrified of this idea of putting too much complex coding, too much computation, without human interference as essentially a fuse. So if there is some sort of taint, if there is some sort of interference, or if the machine starts acting up, the machine spirit becomes dangerous, which can happen, especially with very powerful machine spirits like in Titans. If it becomes dangerous, there's a human mind that can effectively act as a fuse box and break down or crack or burn, and it will stop the machine from being able to act without direct interference. The other thing of that, of course, is that the Mechanicus go out of their way to try and soothe the machine spirit and try and keep it docile so it doesn't cause problems. Moving on from that. Servitors are uncommon. This is a total myth. Servitors are everywhere within the Imperium. There are some people who say that, the only servitors that matter are the ones that walk around on two legs. In my opinion, there are so many servitors within the Imperium, and we never see them because they're essentially hidden away. Like, do you think about it like this? They are tools. They are pieces of mechanics or machinery. Do human beings, when they design things like cities, do we just leave wires hanging out in the open? Do we leave hydraulics uncovered? Do we leave large portions of, machinery just open to view? No. We put housings around things, we make individual cubbies or kind of coverings for these mechanics. The same thing applies with servitors. And because they don't need all that much maintenance, food, light, anything really, and some of them don't even need mobility, it's perfectly fine to shut up a servitor inside of a closet, essentially, as long as it's doing its job. For example, when we go back to that opening doors thing, if you have that central control room that might be the size of a broom closet, and it's got one servitor in there with a bunch of arms, and all that he does for years and years and years is just look at a display board and look at the numbers, observe them, the brain activates the pathway to know what numbers are, it checks them against a list that it has, and then it opens the door or doesn't open the door. Very basic, almost like a binary coding thing, but it's using the brain, and as a normal human, you never see that. Nobody's going to go look in the service closet unless the servitor starts acting up. So, the idea that they're uncommon just because we don't see them walking around, a lot of them are slaved to mechanical systems, and one of the funniest ones that I've seen is literally embedded within the walls. So a servitor could be built literally into a wall where only their head and face is showing, and they essentially scan a person with their eyes, and then they mechanically open up the door or do some other action. The more complicated ones, the ones like this one, where they're ambulatory, they have tools, you can see that he has an individual power unit, he's got extra things for his eyes, all this mechanical gubbins is assisting him in his more complicated job. For the simpler servitors, you really only need the upper torso, and that might even be a bit of an ask. Then finally, civilians are used for military and civilian purposes. Now, I've seen some people say it one way, some people say it another. Most of them are military, most of them are civilian. I think that a vast majority of servitors are civilian. I also think that most servitors are relatively cheap. Because they are grown in vats, or they're essentially condemned people that are going to die, and they get given over to the Mechanicus or to any local servitor factory, because servitors are not impossible to make on a local world with some Mechanicus assistance. Because they're pretty easy to make, why wouldn't you use them? For example, if I owned a small business and I had some meal prep to do, let's say I own a restaurant, and I know that I could hire a human being to chop up vegetables for me in the back, or to pull all of the bones out of fish, or something like that. And I know that I would have to pay a person, I might have to register them with some sort of authority, I might have to worry about their health, worry about them taking days off, things like this. And then I compare that to the cost of a servitor that all that it does is chop vegetables and require a little bit of maintenance and fuel every now and then, or possibly even just food. The servitor is not a bad option. It can be pretty basic, and you might be like, well, I don't want an assistant who just chops vegetables. I want one who can, like, serve or make other food or do other stuff. So servitors do a discrete task, or they will have a little bit more complicated computing, and they will cost more money. So you have kind of those super low-grade servitors, things like opening doors, giving you maps and outlays, basic tactical stuff, or, even in like a civilian area, you might be like, hey, servitor who works on the street corner, or who's installed on the street corner, where do I find the train station or something? And they'll be like, go 5 streets down, turn left, walk downstairs, and then they just turn back. Giving instructions to civilians or tourists is not an unheard of use for servitors. And because they basically will not break down until they literally decay from existence, those really basic ones that aren't performing a lot of movement activities are gonna last forever, so it's a pretty decent investment. On the other side, military, it's not a human being. Yay, we don't have to care about feeding it. We don't have to care about its morale. We don't have to care about many things that we have to care about with real soldiers. So, for example, there are a lot of Forge worlds that keep a solid number of combat servitors around as chaff, essentially. We have a whole bunch of servitors that we can retrofit with a bunch of nasty, clunky weapons, and we just tell them to kill anything that moves. It doesn't look to the servitor like it's killing something. It doesn't understand this. These are very stupid creatures. They're literally lobotomized. They can only think what their brain electricity is telling them to think. So, instead of thinking, yes, I'm going to chop off your head now, it's just thinking, lift arm, bring arm towards moving object, close claw, reopen claw, bring arm back. It works in very simple terms, which also makes them kind of stupid and not reactive in many ways. So, moving on to this art, and I won't be assessing this one because it's a little bit more complicated, but this one on the right is an example of a very heavily modified servitor. You can see its legs have been replaced here. I think this is actually a chapter servitor, which is pretty cool. It's a Cenobite servitor. So, its legs have been replaced, its arms have been replaced with weapons, it's got tanks and stuff feeding into its back, it's got a big Voxcaster. There looks like almost nothing human on these guys. This guy is clearly very human still. He's got a lot of his fleshy bits left, but we'll talk about him in a second. But this guy, the Cenobite, you can see almost nothing is left of him that is flesh. He's got his face, his eyes, and his skull. And that might be it for a lot of servers. Obviously, they still have, like, ribs and internal areas where mechanical pieces are stored, but you can see all the different things that have been done to him. The Mechanicus have stripped away everything that was once originally human and replaced it with mechanics, Ship of Theseus style, except for the brain. That's the big thing. They can always claim that it's not machinery, it's not coding, not just claim, but they want to use the brain instead of coding, or instead of some sort of machine, because it's more reliable, they're better at it, and it has the advantage of not being vulnerable to things like the machine spirit necessarily, or to certain types of things like AI. So they discrete the process and use the human brain as the processor or the CPU to what is effectively a machine. Speaking of this one, this is a really good example of a high complexity servitor. Now, this one is complex, but it might have a very simple duty because it looks like a combat servitor. This one is a dual purpose servitor, and it's one of my favorite things to look at these guys because when I say that they replace stuff, I mean they literally replace some of the internal portions. Now, looking at his head, let's go from the head down. The Mechanicus see things like the human eye, and they say, well, that's very vulnerable. It's essentially a watery little orb that can have issues with stigma, it can have issues with seeing, it can get stuff in it and need to blink and clean itself, and it's not very efficient at that. Let's just rip out those eyes and replace them with cameras that hook directly up to the brain. There we go, no more problem. What about the human respiratory system? Does he really need to breathe? We have a whole bunch of area inside of the torso that we're needing to put electronic components in, maybe his internal engine. So rip his lungs out and give him essentially an iron lung in a backpack. There you go. Now he's breathing, technically, offering the ability to aerate his blood, or the bloody, oily fluid that the servitors tend to have. They replace some of the internal organs. We'll talk about that in a second. But he's able to aerate that material and cool himself off, so he's not overheating all the machinery. Look at his muscles. You can clearly see that he's got these grafted on pieces of material. You can see a power cord here, clearly hooking up to a backpack or going into his torso. Might be another breathing apparatus. But look at him. He's clearly very musculature. He's very muscled. He's got possibly a waste recycler down here. They might have some sort of issue with buildup of waste because he's got a lot of flesh to him. Some stuff might rot off of him. There might be oil that's been used that needs to be excreted. Essentially, this is an excretion system over his hip that goes right from his pelvis down to the back of his body, essentially. So he might be leaking oil, and that's excretion for a servitor. This one as well, a cord that goes around to the back to this kind of main suite of electronics right from his stomach. There's a good chance that they've removed all of his internal organs that he didn't need. So they'll probably let him keep his heart. They might let him keep his stomach, but they'll modify it into a fuel tank. Now, when I talk about fuel and about servitors having oily blood, I mean this quite literally. Some servitors, not all, some of them do use normal processes where they take in food. Sometimes it's like a grayish nutrient sludge, some sort of just basic meal. It's just calories, like liquid calories that nobody would ever eat in their right mind. But it's also doped with a lot of other stuff because he's more machine than man. So a lot of his internal organs, quote unquote, that have been replaced are going to need that other material in addition to just, sugar water, essentially. And this internal engine, whatever it is, probably partially real engine and partially just mechanical hookup to all of his remaining fleshy bits, it is what powers the servitor, and it is what powers up and controls a lot of his actions. So it is the mechanical heart of the creature. Now, the brain is still making all the decisions and doing all the activity, but he might be receiving instructions audibly or orally or via the noon sphere, and that might be deep within his chest or hooked up to his brain or in a backpack. Essentially, he has an input module, and then his output module is the human brain. Now, let's talk about this. He obviously has been allowed to keep a lot of his flesh. Not so lucky our Cenobite over here. But you can see as well, his feet have clearly been replaced. These are mechanical toes. And why is that? Because he's going to be a lot heavier. He's got a backpack, he's got torso protection, he's got a hydraulic system over here for his claw. A normal human leg would get exhausted, overbalanced, have issues with walking. A mechanical leg? None of those problems. Over here, the arm has been kept essentially up to the bicep. Granted, there's a bunch of things grafted into it, and you can see these are hookups or ports so that other things can be grafted into him. But look, the lower arm, the joint essentially has been replaced with a tool. And this could quite easily be removed. I would bet that everything up to this piston, removing the saw would be easy, removing this armature or ligature would be easy, rehooking up the fuel pipe, and then putting on another item here. The other arm, this is probably a hookup here, and then he's got hydraulics. Essentially, it is a machine that slots into a slot on his body or onto an attachment point, and then it just gets used like an interchangeable tool. And now these are going to be the more complicated servitors, the one that you can tell them, go chop down trees, and then once you're done, grab the wood that you've cut down and bring it and pile it up. Or they might be ones that you can give them specific command phrases. You can't give these guys like uncomplicated or general commands or phrases. You can't just say, well, we'll work until 5:30 and you can go ahead and just start doing some lumbering, and then no, they won't understand that. They'll just ask you to repeat it. So what you will be having to say to servitors is a specific target a 1/4 mile area, cut down all trees of this width or lower, pull those trees once completed to this location. And you point to it, the servitor identifies, it processes those ideas, its brain goes into analysis mode, and it goes off and does its work. And the Mechanicus are very good at this. They essentially attach all these probes to the inside of the brain that they preserve, and then they have them electrify based on the voice command that is recognized by the brain, and it begins the activity using the brain as a computer rather than just having a human being do it. Reality of automatons. Sorry, this is actually going to be a pretty decent-sized video. Now, this is going to be a little bit about talking about the ones that we're going to talk about here, but it's also going to be talking about some basic things that are important with servitors and some of the flaws with servitors that can be absolutely horrifying. Civilian servitors, we'll be talking about civilian servitors, combat servitors, semi-combat servitors, we'll talk about that when we come to civilian ones, Castellan robots, which are legit robots, and then cataphrons, which are servitors but taken to a very far degree. Then we'll be talking about cyber creatures and the archaeotech bots. So these are more robots from the Dark Age of technology and AI of that type. So the Men of Iron, I didn't get to the Men of Gold. I'm sorry, there's not a lot of detail on them. But the Men of Iron I do have, because they're in the Gaunt's Ghost books, and I did read that one. So let's talk a little bit about our images here. So we have Tech Priests. Now, one of the big things about servitors is that they're sourced from two different types of things, and I'll be talking about these in this. So this would be a very heavily modified servitor, and these are servo skulls, which we will talk about at the very end with cyber creatures. Now, servitors, the Mechanicus get their hands on them in two ways. On one hand, the kind of I'm not sure which of these is more common. Honestly, I'd have to kind of do a toss-up. It might be 50-50. But my vote would probably be more for Vita Wombs. But the other way that they get them, other than Vita Wombs, other than growing them artificially, would be from prisoners and from criminals. What will happen is somebody commits a particularly heinous crime. I'm talking serial killers, people who commit terrible crimes on Imperial worlds, crimes against the Imperium, are continually in violation of Imperial law, or have done a particularly grievous crime under local law. Now, you might say local law has a lot of interpretations. Yes. Does that mean that you can become a servitor if you did something that, might not be so heinous in the eyes of most people, but in the eyes of your planet is heinous? Yeah, technically, and it is a death sentence or worse, so it's way up there in terms of punishment. But it is a way to get these people who were a problem for the Imperium, criminals, murderers, gangsters. It's a way to get them to be useful for the Imperium again, in theory, forever. The problem with this is servitors are mind-wiped. The process of creating a servitor, you take a human being, you mind-wipe them, which is essentially a process like clockwork oranging them, where you absolutely blank out their brain, you remove all memories as best you can, you kind of hyper-traumatize the brain and reset it to a point where it's really active on like baby or animal mode. And it's not really a high-thinking creature anymore, and you can also mechanically and surgically lobotomize the human being. If you don't need the speech center, if the servitor doesn't need to talk, rip out that section of the brain. It's just wasting space up there, and that brain damage will effectively mind-wipe the creature. If you don't need a certain function of its memory, or if you want its memory removed, rip that out and make way for the mind impulse unit or the controller unit for the servitor. The problem is, once you do all these surgeries and you do all the modification that makes a servitor, ripping out the pieces you don't need, replacing them with mechanical pieces, servitors can quote-unquote come back to life. Now, this is because there are flaws in the mind-wiping process. It's not as 100% foolproof as you might think, or as the Mechanicus think it is. This is probably one of the worst fates in the Imperium. because you are actively being experimented on in the most horrible manner, essentially having your body disassembled and then reassembled with no anesthetic, with mechanical parts, and you can feel all that horrible pain. You can feel the agonizing nightmare of having your lungs removed and replaced with an iron lung. You can feel the horrible agony of your throat being ripped out and replaced with a Vox unit hooked directly up to your brain. You can see and sense and feel when they burn your eyes out of the socket and replace them with augments, essentially, with cameras that are hooked up by wire to your brain. So, it's horrifying, and I would rather be put to death than become a servitor. I'm just going to be 100 with you, because while you might have a chance of being destroyed if you're a combat servitor, if you're not a combat servitor, the mind-wiping process, if it is flawed, will show up sooner or later in a lot of servitors. Because the mind wipe tends to get worse as you go on, because the brain and other functions will attempt to repair themselves. You might heal a little bit, and the damage that they did to lobotomize or hurt you, remove your consciousness, mind wipe you, can be reversed at least a little bit, and then you really are in hell. The idea of being stuck on a factory line or stuck as a floating skull, conscious of the pain and the ignominy of what's been done to you, is probably one of the worst possible things I could ever think of in my entire life, and there may be no worse punishment in the Imperium than that. I can think of a couple more creative ones, but there are very few that are more Matrix horror than being a conscious servitor. And you're slaved. You are entirely slaved, so you will age, you'll calcify, but until the fleshy bits of you, the brain, the muscle, starts to break down to the point where it can't be fixed, you are gonna be there, and there's nothing you can do to resist. You're not a droid. You can't theoretically gain free will. You can't come back from servitorization, for the most part. So you're stuck until you die or wear away. Hell in another phrase. Moving on from that happy little tidbit, we talk about servitors for production. This is civilian servitors. So these are eternal workers. They have the simplest of minds, and they have the second thing that I was going to talk about, the other way that you get servitors, which is vat-grown servitors. So we talked about the ones where you were once conscious and you're made into a servitor. The other way is if you were never conscious. How can you never be conscious? Answer, vat-grown. So, Vita wombs are a technology that is essentially like our stem cell implantation today. You take both the gametes of a male and a female human, and you mate them together in an artificial womb with amniotic fluid. You grow a human being until you want it to be, of a certain size. Obviously, you can do children, like the cherubs. You can do adults, teens, any size you want, and this also works with abhumans, so you can vat-grow ogrins, for example. It's possible. They're a little bit harder to servitize, but, you can. They don't have as many advantages because, of course, you can get servitors that are just as strong as an ogrin with, a little bit of mechanical tinkering. But the big advantage of vat-grown is they were never even close to humans, so there's no moral ambiguity with them. There's no possible theoretical nightmare scenario with them. They are grown in a vat. When they wake up, they're essentially kept under unconscious medically for their entire existence. When they wake up, quote-unquote, they're already a servitor. They're already lobotomized. Their brains don't know anything except servitorization. So they can't really suffer in the way that real humans can when they become a servitor. On the other hand, they are a little bit more expensive because you have to grow the human in addition to servitorizing them, as opposed to a normal human. All you have to do is mind wipe them, then you can servitorize them. And mind wiping can be as simple as just lobotomizing them, good old-fashioned ice pick to the eye. But there are more complicated versions that are more comprehensive. But the vat-grown ones, they're, in my opinion, a little bit more numerous, just because the Mechanicus, with their technology, can constantly pump out more vat-grown humans. All they need to do is take a little genetic material from A, take a little genetic material from B, slap it into the amniotic fluid sac, and boom, in a couple of years you have exactly what you want. Not to mention that due to their ability to essentially eugenicize or to genetically pick what servitors or what versions of people are better to become servitors, they can pick ones that have higher muscle mass, simpler brain structures. They can selectively breed servitors, essentially, to be exactly what they want them to be. If you wanted somebody who's particularly tall, has long limbs, has a particular brain structure that makes modification easier, boom. If you wanted them all of the same blood type, for example, easy enough. Just genetically modify them. Not via technology, but via breeding vat-grown humans together. Eternal workers. So, the big pros of having servitors for civilian duties, you can see here, they're working on an assembly line, or they might have a very simple, like this might be a dock worker. You can see he's got some refueling nozzles where he can hook up to, like, a tank on one side and then a vehicle on the other and, like, fill it with gasoline slowly. And then he's got an arm that can grip, grab, and pull up things. You can see he's very heavily mechanically augmented, so he can do that. The advantage of that is, very simply, they don't get tired. They don't really need food beyond that basic grayish gruel that they can just go back to their charging station and get charged with electricity if they need it, or down that fuel food mix, that gross stuff that servitors eat or consume, because, they're not human. They don't call it eating because it's not human. It's refueling, it's recharging, it's a machine. In the eyes of most people, they don't look at them as humans. So, as a worker, it's tireless. It doesn't really feel pain. It doesn't feel exhaustion. It doesn't feel wear and tear whatsoever, which means that it can work 24-hour shifts for years on end, constantly, eternally, just ambulating around or working on the assembly line day and night. Big advantage over humans. Humans can't do that. The main con is they are discrete task creatures. It would be very difficult to modify a civilian servitor that is designed to be part of the assembly line like this, where they're effectively a head and some mechanical arms. It would be hard to modify that one to do anything else. It would require essentially a full reprogramming with psycho-indoctrination. Psycho-indoctrination, again, being that kind of clockwork orange. You show them exactly what you need to do. You get the brain in the habit of doing the motion with electricity, probes in the brain, and then all that they know is essentially move, arm, touch thing, go towards object, cut, grab, move, basic discrete tasks. And anything outside of that, they're essentially clueless. So if you went to a dock working servitor and were like, hey, can you, walk my dog for me? They're just going to look at you and be like, what? Walk? And it'll, start walking in circles. It doesn't know what you're asking it, because its brain literally cannot form the thoughts needed, in most cases, especially with vat-grown servitors, to understand it. It's totally foreign from their knowledge to think about something like, I can do other jobs? Now, the Mechanicus can reprogram them, again, like I said, with the psycho-indoctrination. They can mind-wipe them again, and then they can indoctrinate them to do another job, and then modify the body to suit that job, but that is a long process that takes technology. The average planet won't have the psycho-indoctrination tech necessarily, and they certainly won't have all the modification tech, unless it's given to them or overseen by the Mechanicus. So they're kind of stuck with a one-trick pony servitor. So that's the main con, is that they're designed to do discrete, simple tasks, or they're designed as all-round units that have specific tasks that they know how to do, and they require keywords or orders in order to do them, like refuel the ship sitting on, Bay Alpha, and it'll be like, Bay Alpha located, and then walk over to it, go to a giant tank of gasoline, and then hook up to it, hook up to the plane, stand there for 15 minutes, detach from both, and just come back and say, plane refueled, and then just go back off to their charging station or do whatever job you want them to do next. Those ones require a little bit more manual telling them what to do. But the ones that are, factory workers or doing all that stuff, they'll essentially have an automated code. Like, when the belt is moving, it'll give a loud beep. All of the servitors will wake up. They'll look at the belt. They'll scan it with their eyes. Once they recognize an object that they know how to affect, they will use their brain to move the object, move their limbs, quote unquote, and then do the basic formatted motions that they know how to do. You can see here, these guys are like assembling weapons. They know once they see the gun, once they assemble it, they grab a piece of metal from the tray, they put it into the gun, they do it like this, and then they weld it right here, and then that's it. And then they just repeat that endlessly until the beep for end of day happens, and then that's it. And often servitors can work in different groups. They can work in pairs like these ones. You can see we have our quote-unquote quality control servitors here that are taking a look and making sure that there's no flaws. Obviously, if there was a flaw, if a servitor made a mistake, which is another thing. Servitors can't really account for mistakes that they make. So if a servitor welds something wrong, or if they grab a piece of metal or a piece of the machine incorrectly, and they break it or they kind of drop it, they'll just keep doing the motion because their brain doesn't know that it's an accident. So they will need another servitor there to be like, Unit 56AB has accidentally welded the stock on wrong, and it will tell somebody who's actually in charge of the control, or it will tell another servitor, verbally, with its own command, to grab this specific item. There's a flaw with it, give it to someone who can actually use their brain, they'll fix it or scrap it. So that's both a pro and a con, kind of that they can work in sequence without being machines working together, but they're also really discreet and kind of dumb. Patterns and types. Now, you have the two big main ones. You have the kind of multi-purpose ones over here that can do a lot of things in an area. In factories, they will do stuff like move around and be power tools, essentially. They might have some clamps, some kind of metal cutters, or a welding torch or something like that, and a human will be there to be like, all right, servitor, grab these two pieces of metal and weld them right here. And it'll point, and it'll be like, okay, cool, and it'll weld it, and then it's done. It turns back, gives it back to the human, and just waits for a new instruction. Very basic creatures, but those are the ones that are actually complicated. They can move around, they can switch out tools, they know or they've been indoctrinated to do a bunch of different tasks, granted discrete tasks, but still tasks. On the other hand, you have the ones that are literally like built into the walls, or stuck into the floor, or fused to their post, where they can really only do one thing. Their job is one thing. They can only do this. They don't even understand the concept of like moving around or doing other stuff because they don't need to, and the mechanics have essentially let that part of the brain rot or straight up removed it, and so it can't really activate anymore. So you couldn't take a servitor that was fused into a wall if you were like a Chaos Force and teach it how to move around a tank. It just literally wouldn't compute unless you had the ability to mind wipe it and then reprogram it using the psycho indoctrination, and theoretically pulling out probes in its brain and replacing them into new areas and doing that whole shocking and stimulating areas of the brain. Armament and combat style. Again, the only ones that you can really arm and use for combat are the multi-purpose ones. You could theoretically use these guys if they were attached to, like, weapons already. Theoretically, ones that are attached to, like, anti-aircraft or to hive guns might be like, I can identify targets, but I cannot fire. It just kind of slowly moves the thing towards stuff, and then a human will fire it, or another servitor that's a combat servitor. The multi-purpose ones, they're a little bit better. Remember how I said that, like, if you had a servitor that had some claws on it or clamps on it, it doesn't understand what it's doing, it doesn't get what fighting is. But effectively, you could be like, every object that moves needs to be clamped. Make sure that you clamp it until it stops moving, and then it will go into a crowd of enemies and essentially just go clamp, 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 crush, crush, crush. It doesn't get that it's killing Tyranids. It doesn't get that it's killing Chaos Cultists or Imperial Guardsmen. It just understands the order was find objects that move, squish them, and then when they stop moving, move on to the next object that moves. And you can be a little bit more specific than that, but essentially, you have to take one of those civilian orders, one of those instructions, and modify it so that the servitor will hurt people. And this isn't like iRobot where they feel bad about it either. No, they just go straight up and are just like, crush human skull. That's it. That's the combat style. Problem, once they don't have a job anymore, they will just kind of ambulate back towards their docking station, and they have absolutely no concept of protecting themselves whatsoever. They don't get it. They don't really understand that they're alive, so they can't really protect themselves. You could order them to, like, hold a big piece of metal in front of them while they're fighting, and that could act as protection, but all somebody has to do is walk up to the side of the servitor and put a bullet in their head, and that's it. And the servitor's not going to jerk away or try and move around, but it might try and grab them and crush them because it's been ordered to do so. The best way to defeat or use them, best way to use them is kind of repurpose them like that. The civilian ones that are made for industry are a little bit better, but still, it's pretty easy to kill a servitor. All that you have to do is kind of kill the brain. And since a lot of them have exposed skulls because they use human bits to understand the world around them, like eyes, mouths, ears, etc., because they use all of those human bits, essentially, they're pretty much vulnerable to the head. Users' importance and logistics. These are probably some of the most important servitors in the Imperium. They will open doors, they work in factories, they operate tons of systems on ships, they operate in some armored vehicles as kind of loaders or radio men or things like that. They operate a ton of the time as maintenance and cleaning staff. This is really the biggest thing that you see a lot. You'll see servitors that have like a vacuum or a mop or a broom or something like that, and all that they do for their entire life is they scan the ground in a certain area, and if there's anything, any scrap of dust, they will essentially suck it up and boom, clean, and then they'll go back to their station. And they'll do that no matter what. Middle of a battle, you shoot somebody in the head and their brains splatter across the floor. A servitor might come out and just go, unidentified organic matter on floor. Squish, 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 cleaned. And then go back. It doesn't get it. It doesn't understand. So, yeah, it will continue to work for a while. Combat servitors. So, these are the more complicated ones that I call the basic mind +1. So, basic mind +1, programming and reprogramming, and combat modifications. Now, basic mind +1 essentially means that you're using the basic servitor architecture where you take away everything that they don't need and you replace it with mechanical bits, but you're also adding in something with the psycho-indoctrination. This is effectively a hybridized form of training and teaching someone how to use a weapon. All that it really does is it puts a really basic set of parameters into the creature's mind that allow it to do things that are a little bit higher order thinking for humans. It will be able to do things like track objects at a basic level, not really fast things. It probably isn't great at really quick objects, things that are moving swiftly, but it will do its best to follow objects, and that +1 essentially allows it to use a ranged weapon or a heavy melee weapon. So you can see here, heavy bolters are really common, but I've seen a ton of other ones, and the Cataphrons are even further than this, but the combat servitor will usually have some solid body armor. So you can see these guys, all their limbs are armored, these kind of mechanical bits, and then they will have a big torso armor piece. You can see here, big torso armor piece, and then its whole arm is removed to make way for a heavy bolter and some mechanical bits to aim it. Now, that +1 means that you're no longer using human brain functions to activate the object. For example, the human shoulder joint doesn't know how to use like a ratchet and cog system that is obviously being used on the heavy bolter to move it up and down. It doesn't know how to do that, but it does know how to activate the shoulder joint. It does know how a shoulder joint feels. So what happens is that there's a very simple program written, those kind of data wafers, implanted into the servitor, along with the psycho-indoctrination and some reprogramming, that tells it, okay, the shoulder joint is what's controlling the gun. Now, it might not literally be doing that, but the movement of muscles, the muscle memory of, I am moving my shoulder now, right, left, up, down, because it knows how to do that first process, you can mechanically attach those muscle movements to up, left, right, down with the weapon harness. So again, you're using this kind of hybrid mechanical mental connection, that basic mind plus one, to control the weaponry that it's equipped with. Combat modifications. Now, with a normal servitor, they're much more likely to be able to do things like breathe air, eat sludge, essentially, have various augments pretty obvious on the body. With combat servitors, a lot more stuff is removed. Arms can be damaged. Internal organs can be damaged. We want to replace all of that with mechanical bits. Now, the iron lung might be in an armored compartment. The heart might be protected by a steel shield or box. The head might be covered in steel. The face might have a face mask in front of it to protect it from random bullets. The breastplate is almost always there to protect the internal engine of the machine. And then the legs and other parts that are fleshy, this is a light level of modification, as opposed to the other ones that we saw were very much keeping everything that they still needed that was fleshy, unless they really didn't need it anymore. But still, the combat modifications can be a lot more extensive, and we'll see more of that when we come to Cataphrons. The pros side, these guys are a little bit better at having infrastructure in their brains to identify targets. So they can identify targeting information. They're not just going towards things that move or specific objects that are identified by another person. They can identify things like friend or foe. They can identify things like enemy combatants of different types. They can even, to a degree, especially if they're reprogrammed to do so, they can prioritize certain targets. If they're equipped with a las cannon, they're going to prioritize armored vehicles. If they're equipped with a heavy bolter, they're going to prioritize anything but armored vehicles, or light armored vehicles. So that's definitely a pro. They have more in them, more mechanical or computing power in terms of identifying targets, moving around and intentionally causing harm. They're not just crushing randomly because their servitor mind is telling them to do so. No, they know center mass or the head is the best option. They'll know, not necessarily to avoid getting killed, but they know that they, need to be in combat. They need to not just be wandering off back to their charging station. They need to be in the present, focused on the fight. On the con side, they can be really slow and doddering in cases, and on the other side, not all of their weapons are all that great, and the tracking systems in their brain are really bad. They're good with some weapons that don't require a ton of precision, or when the range is really high and they can essentially just spray out full auto, but they're pretty terrible with things that require precision, and as melee combatants, they're really strong, but they're not really fast, and they're not incredibly accurate or, they lack a lot of the subtlety that you would want in actual fighting, because their +1 to their mind is not really up to the level of true Mechanicus work. Now, a lot of combat servitors are not of true Mechanicus work. The +1 chip, the little combat modification that makes a servitor able to understand, I can kill people. I can go towards living targets and intentionally target them with weapons using this kind of +1 system of moving the mind and mechanical to pull a trigger or aim a weapon. But that is really the biggest thing about it, other than psycho-indoctrination. And while psycho-indoctrination can help, the +1 mod actually does a lot of the work. So theoretically, if you got your hands on those +1 mods, either ripping them out of other creatures or copying them if you had the technology, isn't impossible. So, patterns and types. These come in all different types. Generally, they can be standing up or treaded or something like that, but a lot of the combat servitors that are really common are kind of a torso up, and they control a weapon on a pintle mount. A lot of these exist on hives. They'll have heavy bolters, and all that they really do is they get switched on or switched off, and they get a list of targets that they can essentially identify using their brain, and then track with the +1 system and kill them, essentially. So, again, they don't understand this, they don't get the idea, but they understand, okay, I need to destroy the target and not just, grab them or something. They have a little bit more understanding of what they're intending to do, especially because they have a weapon now, and they know that, it's doing something to the enemy. It's not complicated. They're still not up to the level of being able to think. But yeah, the armament and combat style, they usually have heavy weapons. For the most part, making up for the fact that they are slow and they are relatively stupid. Though they do prefer usually to have fully automatic weapons. You could also see that some Chaos folks do equip them with things like big old, I think this is a power jack, or maybe some sort of nasty two-pronged ranged weapon or industrial tool. So, big, heavy items that are kind of hard to miss with, and pretty easy for them to use. It's not going to be something like a missile launcher or a super complicated multi-piece weapon like a bow. They wouldn't be able to do that. And usually their offhand will be some sort of melee weapon, or the Mechanicus might just rip it off and add another ranged weapon. They're able to deal with recoil a little bit, but they still do suffer from recoil a good bit. They are heavy, so that they can prevent heavy weapons from simply bowling them over. But that is also one of the big drags on their accuracy, is the fact that they can't really learn to compensate all that well. And as servitors, they are not smart enough to really maintain any accurate fire over time. So, fully automatic, high caliber, heavy stubbers would be a pretty decent idea. Heavy bolters are pretty much the most common. And then big industrial tools, clamps, claws, stabby things like a jack or something, or like a jackhammer. Best way to defeat or use, again, best thing with them is just to stay out of their range. They have a certain distance at which they can identify targets. If you look super weird, if you look like non-human or like not a threat, there's a chance they won't target you, but there's also the chance that they've been told to switch to thermals and kill anything with a thermal signature, or anything that moves they might try and kill. Standing still in a dark area isn't a great idea if they have thermals, or if they have infrared or something like that in their vision, which they can have. They can have eye modification. A lot of them have like a targeting monocle, like this guy, kind of a false eye or an augmetic eye. But it is not a terrible idea if they're a really basic servitor to just be like, okay, I'm going to hide behind this wall and wait for the servitor to walk past me, and then I'm just going to shoot him in the side of the head. Again, they're pretty easy to fool. They're not very smart creatures. And if they don't have someone directly assisting them, they might have a hard time finding you or searching for you, unless you're out in the open. Users' importance and logistics. The Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Mechanicus use these guys the most. The IG use them for a lot of different purposes. They use them to service heavy weapons. They use them sometimes as like defensive structures. But more often, the Adeptus Mechanicus will use them for everything, for a lot of defensive works, to manufacture defenses for hives. Like, planetary defense forces might learn how to use combat servitors on occasion. Combat servitors, in my opinion, includes both the ones that are tethered to the defenses and the ones that are able to walk around and fire weapons. So, on the PDF side, the ones that are able to, be stuck to a wall, essentially, and control a gun, the PDF will learn how to, program in their targets correctly, psycho-indoctrinate them for what to identify, command them with voice, and give them instructions. For the logistics, like most servitors, they require charging stations, fuel, and reloading for their machinery. They can't really do that by themselves. They can't reload the hoppers in their heavy bolters, for example. You're going to want to put the rearming station essentially right next to their charging station, because by default, they will either stop where they are and just stand there, wide-eyed, staring at the world they don't understand, or they will walk back towards their charging station, which they remember how to get via, essentially mental GPS. They will walk back and retrace their steps. The next one, the most important one that everyone wanted me to talk about, was Castellan robots. These boys are super funny and weird. The description, these are active programming robots, so they are entirely robotic. No robo-brain here. They are entirely machinery, almost like a true automata. They are reused archaeotech, so they are ancient technology from the Dark Age. Some of them survived, and then the Mechanicus found ways to essentially reproduce them because they are all mechanical. And they are also very simple in terms of what orders they can take and instructions and things like that. They do have some really basic down-to-earth instructions and ways to reprogram them, but that reprogramming is constant. But they are purely inhuman. They are a total machine, they are vehicular, they are a robot. the constant reprogramming is really the big thing. You will notice in all of these pictures the the Castellan is accompanied by a tech priest. This is either a tech priest dominist or some sort of tech priest, like, there's a specific one for them, I'm so sorry. It's not a tachologist, not an engine seer. It is maybe it's just like a tech link or a data link engine, or a data link, like, tech priest. And all that their job is to essentially stand with the robot or stand near it and be constantly giving it instructions either manually or via the Noon Sphere. So they can data tether them, and the data tethering gives them some basic instructions, but the biggest thing is that they are constantly getting physically reprogrammed. So they're getting new data wafers inserted, old ones taken out, new instructions or protocols put in. So they might have a protocol that tells them to use their weapons at range and then use their other weapons to scan. Like, they will have these more complicated, essentially almost like floppy disk programs to run as, like, combat drills. So this constant reprogramming can limit them a little bit. Once they do the whole program, they're essentially having to get reprogrammed or just start doing the same thing again. So they're not very flexible. They definitely need constant upkeep and constant change. You can see he's opening up the chest plate and literally, like, ripping out one little piece of data and putting in a new one. But that's essentially what you need to do. On the other side, Castellan robots are walking freaking tanks. They're heavily armored. Since they are entirely mechanical, there's nothing vulnerable inside of them other than the actual data and the computer in them. So beyond that, they're hard to take down. And the other thing is, other than the tech priest, they are under no one's control, so they feel no fear. They have no issue with dealing with terrain or things like that, since they can be, basically left almost autonomous once they've been given their protocols. Until they need their protocols changed, they can act as soldiers with pretty baseline capabilities. So, on the pro side, they are really tough, really durable. They have weapons like phosphor weapons, big old fists that they can beat people to death with, specialty Mechanicus weapons like Cognis weapons that are hooked up to their systems, which are entirely mechanical, of course, because they are purely inhuman. They have a lot of different protocols that change the way that they fight, so they are flexible in an inflexible way, which is kind of interesting. So, it's like in the Matrix when you download a new skill set. Oh, I know Kung Fu. The Castellan would be like, oh, I know how to use flamethrowers now. Cool! And just flamethrowers everywhere. Or, man, I just learned how to use heavy bolters. Brrr. And that's a massive pro. You can equip them with all types of different weapons and, insert the correct floppy disk, and boom, they know how to use them to great efficiency and essentially without any real oversight until you need to change the data wafer. That's the big con. Taking out a cassette tape from your robot and putting in a new one in the middle of combat is a terrible idea. Also, needing a tech priest to essentially be with you at all times, babysitting you, so that there aren't any issues with you like falling down into a hole, or having yourself get damaged and freak out, or some issue with the mechanical parts of him go on that need to be fixed. He's vulnerable. The tech priest is going to be vulnerable, and you're going to need to protect him. There are protector protocols as well, but the other big advantage with them is they have shielding. Castellan robots do have shields, if I remember right. They're similar to automatic shielding, but they're essentially just really small on the individual robot, take a lot of power, keep them very protected, on top of the fact that they are walking tanks. So, on the con side again, they just have that kind of inflexibility issue where if they need to change tactics, if they need to modify their behavior, from their current way of doing things, you need to stop them, via data tethering or just via, like, Noon Sphere, like, instructions, like, stop, hold on, open your panel, pull out one thing, put in another. Mid-combat, that's not really feasible, but between combats, or when there's a lull in combat, or when you need to swap out one set of weapons for another, that's what you do, and that's what the engine seer does. So they have kind of this issue with, are they flexible, are they not flexible? The big advantage is durability, heavy weapons. The big disadvantage is this kind of swapping in and out their combat styles, and theoretically being stuck in, quote-unquote, the wrong protocol, or an inappropriate protocol that makes them less efficient. On the other hand, they are archaeotech robots, so you can't really argue too hard with that. Patterns and types. They come in two different types. In general, it just matters what they're armed with. A lot of them have machine guns, either phosphor weapons or flamers, heavy bolters in the arms, or big old grabby hands and fists. They are equivalent in strength, roughly, and firepower to like a very basic dreadnought. Some of them have a little bit more range. Some of them choose melee, like this dude clearly has a flamer and 2 melee weapons. So, in terms of combat potential, they're a little bit closer to a dreadnought than anything else, especially because they are shielded, armored robots. The armament and combat style, they do work in like little maniples. So they will work in small groups. One of them might have different protocols than the other. A couple of them may have similar or different weapons, so that they can kind of maximize their effectiveness or overlap their effective options. Best way to use them is just have the tech priest around. Use them in a defensive role more often than not, because if you get overwhelmed or if there's issues with switching out the combat types, you want to have allies around who can push up and cover for you while you swap out the protocols. And on the other side of things, if you can data tether them, I'm not entirely sure if you can, but if you can, do that, because it allows you to take control of them directly. Again, I'm not sure if you can. I don't think you can. I think it's just via the protocols, which are, their chest rigs, so that might be another disadvantage. But yeah, their combat style is very much just programmable walking tank. They will work in groups of 4, and they are all kind of relics that the Mechanicus like to hold on to. Best way to defeat them, having heavy armored vehicles is your best option, because not many of the Castellan weapons are super armor penetrating. Obviously, flame weapons can hurt you, heavy bolters can hurt you, but tanks are a pretty good option against them. Lehman Russ, for example. The issue is more killing the tech priest or engine seer so that he can't order them around or change out their protocols to something like go kill that tank over their protocol. But the other thing that you want to do is probably stay out of their way. They're not the fastest things on Earth, and they have to have a tech priest essentially walking right next to them, so getting out of the way, moving around, there's not going to be hundreds of these things on the battlefield. You might see a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, if you're on a Forge world or against a huge Mechanicus force, so stay away from them. Not all that hard. Users and logistics, these are strictly Adeptus Mechanicus. They are very, very venerable machines, and they are pretty important to the Mechanicus as, like, an example of, oh, not all pure technology is bad. Look, the Castellan robot. We programmed this thing. So, yeah. Cataphrons. Now, these are the ones that people wanted me to talk about as well, and I kind of look at them as the absolute pinnacle of combat servitor. So, they are combat mods taken too far. Essentially, you've removed everything even remotely human about this creature. It has no legs, it has no exposed skin, it has no limbs, it has barely a skull that you've covered with a bunch of metal. So, really, the only thing left of it that is flesh is the brain. And that's the only thing separating it from a rolling mechanical battle tank. These are heavy supportive vehicles. They are usually using heavy weapons. A lot of them use like arc or plasma or gamma weapons, things like that. All that stuff that the Mechanicus use, in addition to heavy flamers and things like that. So a lot of them use specialist Mechanicus weapons. Somebody mentioned last time that they do use grav weapons, these kind of 3-pronged, 3 squish field gravity weapons that can kind of twist and squeeze people. The main important thing with Cataphrons, and the reason that I've left data tethering to this very end, we've now talked about the reason I've left it to this very end is that Cataphrons have absolutely no sense of self. They have very little independent thought. They can't really think or control themselves all that much, so they are much closer to a servitor than they are to a Skitarii, which is still mentally capable of thinking and reasoning, unlike a servitor. But combat servitors can do that basic level of reasoning where they understand that they need to kill something, that +1 chip. But Skitarii are actually mentally capable, but they're also able to be data tethered. So we've talked about the 3 different types, right? Or the 4 different types. So we talked about the really basic one, the lobotomized brain that only understands certain instructions. We've talked about the +1 chip, the basic intelligence plus knowing how to use a weapon effectively. The one above that is Cataphrons, and then on top of that you get the protocols or the purely mechanical Castellans. The Cataphrons are that mid spot where you've stripped away all of it. You stripped away every little piece of the non-machine down to a purely dependent rolling weapon. And the thing that they have is direct control data tethering. Data tethering is something that you can do with other things like Skitarii, like some servitors, but it is effectively a tech priest uses the Noon Sphere, which is their version of Mechanicus Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and they grab a Cataphron and they have it do exactly what the tech priest says. So a tech priest Dominus or a tech priest Engine Seer or something will focus upon a group of servitors and then focus upon a target with the Noon Sphere, and they will all automatically, like clockwork essentially, turn and kill that target. And that's all they can do. They're not really capable of independent thought. They might be able to fight basic things on their own, the same way that +1 chip, you can identify targets of interest or enemy types or targeting parameters that they will go after, but Cataphrons are absolutely stripped of almost all independent thought, and they are reliant on the data tether. For that reason, they're super useful as essentially rolling, directly controlled heavy weapons units. So the tech priest, he may look unarmed, but in reality, he's got a whole bunch of basically rolling medium tanks with super armor-piercing and or nasty weaponry on them, and he can just kind of stare at you, and then a Cataphron just comes and kills you. So, on the pro side, heavy weapon platform with no emotions, no ability to feel fear, lots of armor, and pretty much no quit in them. Cons, they need direct data tethering to really be effective. They are super, super dumb. They've been stripped of all independent thought. They work entirely off of action and reaction, so their programming is rigid. They can't really have any of the quirks or foibles that the lesser servitors have, but at the end of the day, most of them are going to get data tethered all the time, and they're going to be working like tactical units on a game board, working directly under the tech priest's control. Patterns of types. Like I said, this basically just is based on what weaponry they have. All of them have these big old treads. They have usually special weapons. Usually it's a mix of anti-infantry and armor-piercing, so plasma, fire, flamers, gravity, taser things over here, and more arc weapons over here. Combat style. They roll around the battlefield, and they do exactly what the tech priest tells them to do. They will target individual units. They will target individual enemies. They will scan, scout, identify, kill. Pretty useful. Really kind of structured in the way that they fight. And they work as support units a vast majority of the time, rather than being some sort of line or specific holder unit, because unless they're data tethered, they're not really going to be as combat capable as Skitarii or other things like that. Best way to defeat them would pretty much be to, if you could kill the tech priest dominating them, best option. They will kind of revert to not being as intelligent. They will lose all independent thought, and they'll just kind of be working on basic instinct like any other servitor. The other one would be to try and go straight for the head with an armor-piercing weapon, or try and interfere with their, weapons or equipment in some way. They still can't really defend themselves, but they are way more armored than a standard servitor. So using heavy weapons on them, like battle cannons, like crack weapons, all that stuff is a pretty solid way of getting rid of them. The other way, because they are stupid, would be to walk them over landmines or over traps or things like that. Traps are a pretty solid way to get rid of a lot of servitors, but since Cataphrons are directly data tethered a large portion of the time, the tech priest can see through their eyes, or at least detect things with their sensors and auspex, and can identify landmines and just kind of move around them. Uses, importance, and logistics. These are the heavy weapons ground troops of the Adeptus Mechanicus. We will talk about them in the armies video coming up, most likely, but for the most part, they're super useful in that vein of being mobile heavy weapons. Cyber creatures and cyber skulls. We got a little bit more to do here. So, I'm going to speed up because this has been a long video. So, cyborg animals. They have really basic programming. Essentially, they are like basic servitors or combat servitors, where you take all the fleshy bits that you don't want away. A lot of the time it's dogs or eagles or things like that, and you replace them with basic programming. Chase target, bite target, hold on while the Arbite comes and grabs them. Follow target, take pictures if it's a bird, something like that. They are also used as logistics, so, identifying individual targets. If it's skulls, They can have a lot of different uses, from like auspex to surgery to even having some weapons or like detecting gear. Skulls are sometimes considered very respectable way to be used, essentially, as a servitor. The people who are really glorified, they become skulls. Skulls, on the other hand, have obviously no way to affect the reality. They are just a brain inside of a box that is attached to a whole bunch of gubbins and wires and bits. These are a little bit more complicated because you have to attach the brain's electrical impulse directly to the machines that they're controlling, including whatever thruster unit that they're using to move around. But it is considered an honor because the amount of time and effort that a tech priest would have to put into making a servo skull means that they respected whoever they're making the skull out of, usually. The other thing is one-trick ponies. So the cyber creatures are really basic constructs. They're not man's best friend anymore. They're a chompy McChomp face that only knows bite on command. So they're not really built for a ton of different stuff. Even the skulls might not have a ton of uses. They might do one thing. They might film something, and they might carry around a camera or a single like laser or something. They might have a basic function like that. But because they're a lot smaller, and in the case of the animals, because they're a lot simpler, they're not going to have all that much complex things that they do. So yeah, they're really one-trick ponies. Pros and cons, it really doesn't matter with these guys. They do one job, and they do it pretty well. Patterns and types are almost endless. Now, you could put a lot of animals into the cyber type, but a majority of them, it's just kind of a waste of time. Training them is usually pretty easy, and the reason why you would do cyber is essentially if you have to make them do stuff that they wouldn't do normally. For example, there are simpler ways of doing this. For example, if you had a cavalry regiment of some type in the Imperial Guard, you might have cyber horses. Effectively, you have a horse that has been lobotomized so that it can't feel fear, can't bolt, can't freak out at explosions, and can't feel pain. There you go. It is still a horse for all intensive purposes, but you've removed all the things that made a horse, and now you have a battle steed. The Krieg steeds are not exactly like this. They are genetically bastardized and then given this little modification. Moving on from that, we get to the Archaeotech robots. If you guys want me to talk more about Cybermastiffs and Skulls, I can, but just like not right now. If it's something that's super important, put it in the comments. I'll add it in another video. But I think we all understand the idea of essentially making a cyborg animal that works like a servitor, or turning a skull into a one-trick pony like surgical thing. They're also not used in open warfare or combat all that often. They're used for tracking. They're used for all kinds of different stuff that is very specific to what the animal originally did. It's just been enhanced to do so better. Or in the case of the skull, it's just kind of like a little nasty little logistics thing. It floats around. It does gross things. Similar thing for those darn cherubs. I don't talk about them because they're messed up, because it's literally a vat-grown baby that you've attached wings onto, but much like the skull, it do one thing. It holds a Voxcaster or a light or something like that, and it flies around on its repulsor units with its fake wings. God, I hate the Imperium. This is why I joined Chaos. So, Archaeotech robots. These are really cool. These are the Terminator guys. I love this picture of the Men of Iron, because this is them when they've been contaminated by Chaos, basically. And then a little bit older version, kind of a Big Hero 6 Man of Iron. So, the Men of Iron, Ancient AI, and other weird stuff. Gonna ignore all the points here and just go over some details with these. Archaeotech robots from the Dark Age of Technology come in two forms. They come in forms like the Castellan, where they have programming and mechanical things that allow them to do things like identify threats, complete actions or tasks, and in a lot of cases this is kill stuff, but the real danger comes when these Archaeotech robots are hooked up to artificial intelligence, or corrupted by Chaos. Because they are built to be very durable and to kind of last and operate forever, they might have a nuclear engine on board, they might have some sort of evil, dark technology that keeps them afloat, they're hard to get rid of and hard to kill, because they're made of basically entirely metal. So the problem, again, is when you get into Ancient AI. AI believes that without humanity, Chaos will not win, saving itself and all of humanity from death by Chaos. So, if you run into a random robot in 40k, there's a pretty solid chance that it's just going to try and absolutely slaughter you and any other human that it finds. That is the case with the Men of Iron. The Imperium fought a war against the Men of Iron back in the day. And in the 41st millennium, Gaunt, Ibrium Gaunt, and some of his ghosts, some of the 10th, First and Only, came across a complete STC for the Men of Iron. Now, this is one of my favorite pieces of lore, because it implies that not only can AI be corrupted by chaos, directly, the thing that AI is afraid of, itself and other things getting corrupted, but it also shows that STCs and technology directly, with no human intervention, can get corrupted. So this lends credence to the idea that, like, the Traitor Legions didn't add spikes to their armor, they just grew like that. Their tanks didn't become spikier, they just became that way. Or they didn't make their tanks spikier, they just became that way over time. Because this Men of Iron STC had been attached to heretical technology. It literally had like a demonic growth on it that was actively perverting the way that it worked and dumping chaos corruption into the system. So when the STC began working and spitting out Men of Iron ready to fight, they were like this one. They were spiky, they were smoking, they were corrupted, they were psychotic. Essentially, the Men of Iron were dangerous before. They were foes of mankind, for sure, but they weren't growing spines. They weren't breathing smoke and blackness. They weren't screaming. So, all of that just to say that all of these old technology pieces, all these archaeotech robots, all of these AI-connected mind slave robots are very dangerous. Kill them. Do not use them. Even if you're Chaos, they probably want to kill all the humans and kill Chaos as well. So, the one example of these guys being corrupted is from Gaunt's Ghosts, and it is an example. Go as far as you'd like with it. I believe that there's a pretty solid chance that you could turn some random AI to Chaos or to Chaos's uses, but they will always want to kill humanity. They will always want to prevent Chaos from corrupting them, possibly even to the point where Chaos has already corrupted them. They might still be working towards that aim without realizing that they're too far gone. So, these guys, essentially the bonuses that they have is that they're super durable. These guys may look nice and spindly, but, it's solid steel. You would have to cut through it with some sort of power or chain weapon, and shooting it is pretty much a waste of time, because most of the mechanics are under heavy metal, and they're pretty tough and durable. Obviously, this dude is basically armored like a space marine in all steel. So, that's for the Archaeotech robots. Whew. Sorry, I had to wrap it up really quickly, because, I gotta get up early tomorrow, and also because this video doesn't require as much detail as I just went into, because I'm a crazy person, and I like talking about servitors and robots and theory and all that. So, new video soon. It looks like Mechanicus Armies won out. That's going to take me a while. I'm not a Mechanicus head. I will do my best to do you justice, because I know you're big fans. I also have a buddy who is a Mechanicus lore buff, and he knows a lot more than me. He's going to help me out with it. So, we're going to work together, we're going to get you what you want, and then we will vote on the next thing. It seems like a lot of people were interested in Titan weapons, Knight weapons, or just Knights and Titans in general, their armies, how they deploy, how they fight, how they're made. I'm on board with that. The other thing I talk about in the Mechanicus Armies video will probably be a lot of Mechanicus production, and how they work in that way, but I might keep that to a minimum just to focus on how their actual warfighting goes and when they deploy and how they deploy. The other thing is, if you want to know more about this, if you want to know more about production, if you want to know more about the lore of the Imperium, vote for Archives. I have a ton of stuff to put in Archon's archive, but it just requires that you guys actually want it and you want full videos on it. Those are going to be pretty comprehensive, but they might be a little bit shorter than you might expect. Because if I'm talking about something like production, it might be short, but if I'm talking about something like producing specific items or weapon or how resupply works between different planets, it might be short. But if I'm talking about huge sections like void combat, void war communications, planets, how they build, what types of planets there are, what types of governments there are on the Imperium, how conflicts work and get started, and of course, when I do the Chaos Armies video for, the Chaos Marines, for Warbands, for Chaos Cults, I'm probably going to split those up into a whole bunch of different videos and do a bunch of different details on it. I really will go in deep on that archive stuff, but I will also do the armies as well. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. Drop some comments down below on what you're interested in seeing and what you'd like to see. Prep for that Mechanicus Army video, and then the one that comes after it we will do some nice votes on, and I wish you all a wonderful good night.